Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at the theory of perception known as idealism, which is generally credited to Bishop George Berkeley. Now, George Berkeley was an Irish philosopher and a theist, and that's important. And in 1713 he came to England and then became Bishop of Cloyne, a small town in Ireland, in 1734. He died suddenly in Oxford in 1753 whilst listening to his wife reading one of his own sermons aloud, and he's buried in Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. And one can only imagine the quality of the sermon that was being read back to him. Anyway, arguably the credibility of many of his arguments does rest on his belief in God, but we'll see how that works shortly. Before we get going on idealism itself, it's worth just remembering a couple of criticisms of representative realism, because these are crucial in terms of how Berkeley constructs his own argument. So, indirect or representative realism assumes the mind-independent world exists, but that the veil of perception means that we can never know how the world is in itself. And so the question there is, does the mind-independent world really exist at all? Now, Berkeley seizes on this idea. He says, how can we be sure of a causal link between our perceptions, our sense data, and the mind-independent world? In order to know that the mind-independent world causes our sense data, we must be able to verify that link, the causal link, independently. In other words, from outside of our sense data. And of course, we're not able to do that. So, as I say, Berkeley seizes on this, and from this he attacks the distinction that Locke makes between primary and secondary qualities, and he argues that this distinction just cannot be maintained. Can one imagine a physical object with the primary qualities of size and shape, for example, without the secondary quality of colour? And Berkeley thinks that we can't. Right? You know, any object that has a size and a shape must also have a colour. So he thinks that all of these ideas, not just the secondary qualities, are in the mind. Okay, so everything he thinks we are aware of in some sense is an idea in the mind, hence idealism. All right, so ideas Berkeley thinks include sensations, images, concepts and thoughts. And he rejects Locke's idea or argument of abstract general ideas that we gain purely through experience and subsequently develop through abstraction and combination. And I detail how that works in my video on John Locke. So, mind-independent objects and the mind-independent world does not exist according to Berkeley because it is impossible to conceive of it outside of the mind. The very idea of a mind-independent world is itself an idea in the mind. Right? Without the mind, there would be no mind-independent world. So, in this sense, idealism is a theory of perception that denies the existence of a mind-independent world. And bear in mind that the other two theories that you need to know, direct realism, indirect realism, they both argue that there is in some sense a mind-independent world. Berkeley's idealism is the only theory you need to know that denies the existence of a mind-independent world. Okay, so this argument that Berkeley presents us with, that objects are ideas in the mind, is known as his master argument. Right? It's basically how idealism is set out. It's known as his master argument, and you need to know that term. And his argument, as I say, is perhaps best exemplified by the phrase, to be is to be perceived. Or if you want to give it its Latin phrasing, esse est percipi. Right? To be is to be perceived. Now, Berkeley argues for this in the sense that the only things that we can properly hold to exist are the active minds and the ideas contained within those minds. All right? And from that, he says that even ideas such as being and existence are ideas that rely on being perceived. Okay? So the very idea of existence is itself mind dependent. Right? If there was no mind, there would be no existence, because there would be no idea of existence. Now you can put this another way and look around the room and see all the tables and chairs, and you just understand, or Berkeley thinks you understand these as just collections of ideas in the mind. So the concept of a table is an idea, the concept of a chair is an idea. Right? What they're actually made up of, wood, metal and so on, all of these things are ideas. The very idea of a physical object, right? It's just an idea, it's all in the mind. All of the things that we see are just bundles of ideas in the mind. All right. Now let's just look at this for a minute. On the one hand, it does seem that ideas such as tables, chairs, knives, forks, carpet, all seem to rely on the mind for sense. All right. If there wasn't a mind, these ideas just would not exist. All right. Any of them. On the other hand, if such things rely on being perceived in order to exist, then it seems to follow that there's no definite way, no concrete way we can understand them as existing when we don't perceive them. And this turns out to be a problem for Berkeley, which we'll get to. But before that, let's just ask ourselves some questions. Why is that a table? When you look at the table, why is it a table? Table, the concept of table, certainly doesn't seem to exist independently of your mind. Neither do the ideas of wood and metal. Right? They all seem to be ideas in your mind. In the same way that physical object, the idea physical object, is in your mind. All right? And indeed, you could push this further and say the very idea of the external world is in your mind, and it's only in your mind. It's nowhere else. But the problem that Berkeley has is what happens when there is no mind doing the perceiving. Are we to take it that objects such as tables and chairs do not exist when we can't see them? This just seems absurd. You know, when you leave the room, do the tables and chairs in the room and the room itself cease to exist? Because anything that we can count as an idea, according to Berkeley, requires that you're perceiving it. So, you know, perhaps the room also just disappears. And this is where Berkeley relies on God. Okay, he does have an answer to these questions, but it does rely on a belief in God. And he believes that the world is continually perceived by an all-knowing, omnipresent being. All right, an infinite being. So God is in possession of all the ideas that we have at any particular time, and under the correct circumstances, which are presumably determined by God, we partake of God's knowledge and God's ideas. Thus, when I walk into a room, God brings into my mind the relevant ideas. Thus, that room will always be there. Now, a slightly different kind of objection, but one that I think is good for you to know about, is Dr. Samuel Johnson's rebuttal of Berkeley's idealism. And Johnson's objection doesn't quite work. Right? He allegedly kicked a stone and declared as he did so, "I refute him thus," meaning that, you know, he could kick the stone across the room, and that meant that he saw the stone move, he felt the pain, and so on. He said, "Well, this is obviously, you know, the stone is outside of my mind." Right? And his point was, as I say, that it was obvious there were physical objects that existed independently of his mind, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to kick the stone. But this isn't really that great an objection, because all of what he did could be thought of under perception, thought and sensation. So all of the things that he's thinking of as trying to show Berkeley is wrong, all of those things are in themselves ideas in Johnson's mind. All right? So it's quite a famous kind of rejection of Berkeley's idealism, but it doesn't quite work. And so it'd be useful perhaps to bring into an essay. Further criticisms. Idealism does tend to force solipsism on us. Right? If we've no reason to suppose that anything exists other than our own mind and our perceptions, then obviously that leaves us in a solipsistic position. Right? And solipsism being the belief that we can't be sure of the existence of anything but our own minds. Now, of course, because Berkeley is a theist, because he believes in God, he doesn't think that there is a danger of solipsism. Solipsism is only a problem if we accept the arguments of idealism, but without God. All right. Secondly, there is the argument from hallucination. Now, if everything is ideas in the mind, or if all of what we perceive are ideas in the mind, then how can we distinguish between hallucinations and everything else? Because hallucinations are also just in the mind. So it would seem that everything could be an hallucination. Now, Berkeley might reply to this, and he might say, well, look, whilst you are perceiving something, then you get your knowledge from experience. All right? Then you can look around you. You've got your idea of the mind-independent world, the external world. Right? You learn from it because you perceive it. The problem is that it's all just an idea in the mind. But that in itself would allow you then to make a distinction in your own mind between hallucinations and reality, if you like. But it's not perhaps that satisfactory a reply. It's important to note, however, that there is a fundamental difference between Descartes and Berkeley. Now, Descartes, as you'll know, also argues himself into solipsism with the cogito, the I think therefore I am, after the evil demon argument. So Descartes believes in the possibility of solipsism as a result of the evil demon, but Berkeley is actually an empiricist, someone who believes that all knowledge comes from experience, albeit a very strange empiricist. Right? So we are able to gain knowledge through experience whilst we're perceiving, because of course experience is itself a form of perception. So whilst we are experiencing things, we are able to learn. Right? And we learn all of these ideas through experience. But Berkeley's solipsism kind of comes from a different place. It comes from this idea that all of everything is just ideas in the mind, or collections of ideas in the mind. Whereas Descartes believes that it could be the case that the evil demon is deceiving us about the mind-independent world. All right. Now, let's look at some further thoughts about Berkeley's arguments. Are the arguments any good? Well, we'll return to the theist idea for a moment. God has implanted ideas in my mind. All right? But if God has implanted the ideas in your mind, then are those ideas actually ideas actually yours? All right? Perhaps someone else could have exactly the same ideas as you. Moreover, the term idea seems very broad. It covers perceptions, sensations, images, concepts, and thoughts. All right? So there may be an avenue that you can argue against Berkeley there. Although perhaps Berkeley would say, well, look, the very idea of perception, I've just said it myself, is an idea. Right? So again, it's mind dependent. And what is meant by the mind? Now, Berkeley does talk about all ideas being in the mind. Now, if the mind is something that contains ideas, then perhaps it's physical, and then that would seem to suggest that there is something other than just the sensations and the perceptions that exists, namely the thing that is required for them to exist. That is the mind. Okay, so that's actually quite a rich and useful avenue of objection that you might want to go down there. There are, of course, some areas of commonality between idealism and representative realism. The first is that sensory experience is the basic ingredient of experiencing the world. So what we gain through our five senses. Berkeley also believes in sensory experience. So representative realists and idealists agree that our experience of the world is how it is represented to us by our perceptions. But the idealist pushes this further by arguing that we have no justification for supposing that the external world exists beyond our own mind. Right? It is just a product of our ideas. Whereas the representative realist believes that there is a causal link between a genuinely existing mind-independent world and our sense data. Now, a counter-argument to Cartesian skepticism is that Descartes supposed that we couldn't know whether the senses gave us an accurate picture of the external world or not. All right, so his thought was that we have perceptions, The assumption is there is an external world, but we can't know whether our perceptions are accurate or not, and it could be the case, in fact, that the evil demon is possessing our minds and getting us to believe everything that is not true. All right. Now, Berkeley, by suggesting that physical objects are our ideas, literally, and that there's nothing else but our ideas, there's no need to worry about this whole evil demon thing. All right, there's no need to worry about a link between our perceptions and the external world, because the very idea of the external world is actually something in our own mind. All right. So Berkeley can actually counter Cartesian skepticism in this way by saying, well, look, all of the ideas that you have are in your mind. They are just collections of ideas in the mind, everything that you believe and so on. Thus, we don't need to worry about any kind of link between a genuinely existing mind-independent world and how that is represented to us in perception. And that's the end of this video.